So we're now entering into some more exciting territory. This is based on the work by Carla McLaren called The Language of Emotions. When I first saw that title, I said, I'm getting this book. I was taught in my family and society basically to repress all emotions, that I'm a male and I'm strong and I don't experience things like fear. I certainly don't express it. So actually, for me, the only emotion that was allowed was, no surprise, anger. So we're going to use her work, which I think is quite extraordinary, along with the other work that we've done earlier, called The Language of Emotions. And I'm going to start with a quote, or maybe a near quote, from Eckhart Tolle. Real important. Emotions are thoughts reflected in the body. So think about that a minute or so. Emotions are thoughts reflected in the body. So one thing I'm going to add to McLaren's work is a three-step process in dealing with and transforming emotions and moods. It begins with claim it. The emotion or the mood is yours. It doesn't belong to anyone else. If you've noticed, when people are in certain emotional states, they have a tendency to blame the other. It is not the other, it is me. This is my emotion, this is my mood, and I'm going to be in a powerful position to use it to transform. And as we get into McLaren's work, it's going to be clear. So claim it, own it. It's mine, it's yours. The second step is name it. So McLaren's going to talk about a bunch of different names, and we're going to go through this. It may take us 3 YouTubes, but it's worth it. And the last step is read it using McLaren's work. So we have claim it, name it, read it. Simple 3-step process. And by the way, a lot of this work is somewhat simple and maybe not easy. So as you simply notice your emotional state, claim it. It's mine. It's not the object of projection, which many of us do, if not all of us. Name it and read it. So today we're going to have somewhat of an experience with McLaren's work, and we're going to start with the emotion of anger. So let me walk through her protocol. She talks about the gifts of all emotions. Now, that's an unusual thought in our society. Again, I think many of us are taught to repress certain emotional states. So we're going to look at the gifts, and particularly today, the gifts of anger, and internal questions related to the emotion or mood, the signs of obstruction, both expressive and repressive, and certain practices we can engage in order to transform the emotion/mood. So, what anger is about is often it's about protection and restoration. So I'm going to ask you to think of a time, maybe recently, maybe now, that you've been angry or in a rage, which is the mood state of the emotion. So think about a time where you were angry, or maybe you are angry. Or in a rage, or even possibly in resentment. So what this emotion includes is rage, fury, and the healing of trauma. Now, in the work I've done with lots of people, adults and high school students, is I don't know anyone who has not experienced trauma. So we may in future episodes in this series look at trauma. In fact, we will. If you have experienced trauma, I would highly recommend starting with Peter Levine. He's done a lot of work with trauma. So let's personalize this and look at the gifts of anger. The first gift is honor. Often we need to honor something about ourselves when we're in anger or rage. The second gift is conviction. Often anger will be telling us what we're compassionate about. So if there's anybody in the world, and there's a lot of talk about politicians right now, and you're experiencing anger, it's pointing to your own conviction. So it may be pointing to things like compassion or passion, what you really love. So when we go within and look at anger, we can look for the gift called conviction. The third gift she identifies is proper boundaries. We know that there's a prevalence of abusive relationships in this country. Well, part of that is about not having proper boundaries. So people are intruding upon us through their anger or other emotional states, and we lack proper boundaries, and we find ourselves as being a victim. The next gift is protection of yourself and others. Now, that's pretty self-evident. So if we're being attacked physically or psychologically, and, if our children are being attacked by someone, criticized, we need to talk about establishing boundaries and teaching our children how to do that. The next one she mentions is healthy detachment. Now, in Al-Anon, which is for people in relationship with those who are addicted, like alcoholism, what they talk about is lovingly detach. So notice lovingly detach. It does not mean to become aloof. It may call for just moving out of the relationship. So healthy detachment. Here are some questions internal to anger and rage, or resentment or fury. What must be protected? Whether it's psychological and or physical. So what is it we're protecting? It could actually be our value system, our beliefs that we're attempting to protect. What must be restored? So that loops back to the gifts. Maybe our honor needs to be restored, our integrity. Maybe we need to restore our convictions based on our values. So here are some signs of obstruction which are unhealthy. The repressive signs of obstruction with anger are enmeshment, which is back to no boundaries or weak boundaries. Self-abandonment. Now that is devastating, to abandon oneself. Apathy, which is rather interesting because if you look at the word, it's a lack of passion. It's apathos, a lack of passion or compassion, including oneself. Depression. So it's interesting to see the connection between depression and anger, or repressed anger. Another repressive obstruction is boundary loss. So we talked about that earlier. You know, that gets into denial, and I'm going to stay in this situation even though it might be abusive. So boundary loss. Here are some expressive signs of obstruction. Cycling rages that create harsh boundaries. So remember, McLaren is saying establish healthy boundaries, not harsh boundaries. Hatred and prejudice. Now that is pretty obvious in today's world. It seems to be everywhere. So what she's suggesting is, or what she's saying is, that's an expressive obstruction. Hatred and prejudice. And the last she mentions is isolation. So withdrawal. So I'm going to get out of this even though I'm still in it kind of approach. Here are some practices with anger / rage, fury. Channel the fiery intensity of anger into your boundary. So let anger help you establish your boundary instead of repressing it or exploding with it. So we have repression and expression, which are very unhealthy. Then speak your truth or make your corrective actions. Now, corrective actions, one example of that is our ability to make amends. This will reset your boundaries in a healthy way, which will protect you and your relationships. So once again, her basic protocol is looking at the gifts, looking at internal questions. And by the way, you can elaborate on her questions and her gifts. Looking at signs of obstruction, both expressive and repressive, and certain kinds of practices. So a reminder, regardless of the emotion or mood, remind yourself to simply notice. Now you're in a position to play with possibilities, one of which is to use the principles that govern thinking. Another is to use the information provided by McLaren about the language of emotions. It's interesting she called it the language of emotions because emotional states are actually communicating to us in a variety of ways. The next emotion we're going to look at is fear. So if you notice you're in fear, you can think about fear is basically about intuition and action. So what it includes is anxiety. And by the way, to me, anxiety is fear in the body. We feel anxious. Worry, and it also involves the healing of trauma. And I want to emphasize again the importance of the healing of trauma. Some of the gifts of fear, well, let me go back a second. Think of a situation that you've been in, you are in, that you notice there's fear associated with it. So we're going to personalize this again. The gifts are intuition. So if you're experiencing fear, look at intuition. Now, intuition is beyond the rational mind. It is our sixth sense. It's a sense that's fairly been repressed, or unfairly been repressed in our society. It also provides focus. So we know that when animals are in a state of fear, or we're in a state of fear, there's a tremendous amount of focus. One of the other gifts is clarity. Clearly seeing what's going on here while I'm in fear. Attentiveness. Readiness. So we know biochemically and neurologically, when we're in fear, we become very ready, and usually people talk about to flee, to freeze, or to fight. And vigor. Now that's interesting, another paradox. So fear provides vigor, which again, that's exactly what happens. The internal questions are, what action needs to be taken now? So it gives us an action orientation. Many people, including myself, get stuck in fear and we're immobilized. Here are some signs of obstruction. Constant worries or anxieties that decrease your focus and clarity. Here are some practices you can engage in when you notice you're in fear or anxiety. Focus your attention in your fears. So what am I afraid of? And there's where I can attend. And by the way, fear for the most part is based in anticipation of the future. So it is a future orientation. Prepare yourself, act and move consciously, and revitalize your psyche with a dynamic focus fear brings to you. Now that's really interesting. There's a way to practice fear. Notice, focus your attention. So it goes back to what we attend to increases or magnifies. So focus your attention in your fears. Look at it. And ask yourself, what are the gifts associated with fear? Again, intuition, focus, clarity, attentiveness, readiness, and vigor. Okay.